The waters rippled silently as dawn broke over the tiny Pacific atoll on June 4, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron peered through his binoculars from the deck of the USS Hornet, scanning the horizon for any sign of the Japanese fleet. He knew what was coming. They all did. But knowing and seeing were different things entirely. Somewhere beyond the endless blue expanse of ocean lay the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. The Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet, commanded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor's devastation just 6 months earlier. "They're coming for Midway," Waldron whispered to himself, "and we're all that stands between them and the West Coast." Midway Atoll, so named because it sits midway between North America and Asia, was little more than a speck of coral and sand in the vast Pacific Ocean. Just 6 miles in diameter, this seemingly insignificant landmass was about to become the pivot point upon which the entire Pacific War would turn. The Japanese advance across the Pacific had been relentless. After Pearl Harbor came the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch, East Indies, and more. The Rising Sun's empire expanded with each passing month, pushing ever eastward. By May 1942, Japan controlled nearly a third of the world's surface. Their next target, Midway Atoll, the last American stronghold before Hawaii. According to the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, Midway was not merely a battle for territory, but a struggle for naval supremacy in the Pacific. Had Japan succeeded, the Hawaiian Islands would have been isolated, and the American West Coast directly threatened. Admiral Yamamoto had crafted an elaborate trap. His plan: use Midway as bait to lure the remaining American carriers into battle, where his superior force could annihilate them once and for all. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed toward Midway, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Over 200 aircraft waited on their decks, poised to strike. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had broken Japan's naval code. Naval intelligence had intercepted and deciphered messages revealing the entire Japanese plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, ready to ambush the would-be ambushers. The Yorktown's presence was particularly remarkable. Just 1 month earlier, she had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese intelligence correctly reported her crippled, assuming she would be in dry dock for months. Instead, round-the-clock repairs at Pearl Harbor had returned her to service in just 72 hours, an engineering miracle that would prove decisive. As night fell on June 3rd, both fleets sailed toward their destiny, still unaware of each other's exact positions. On Midway itself, Marine defenders dug in, reinforcing positions around the vital airfield. Army B-17 bombers flew in from Hawaii. The island's population of goonie birds, large, ungainly albatrosses, waddled about, oblivious to the gathering storm. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst whose code-breaking had given the Americans their edge, paced nervously in his underground office at Pearl Harbor. Had his intelligence assessment been correct? Would the Japanese really attack Midway, or was this an elaborate feint? Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo reviewed the final attack plans. His pilots would strike Midway at dawn, eliminating its air defenses. Then his carriers would deal with any American naval response, if one came. The plan seemed flawless. As stars wheeled overhead in the warm Pacific night, sailors on both sides tried to sleep, many for the last time. Within hours, the fate of the Pacific War, and perhaps the outcome of World War II itself, would be decided around this tiny atoll with its nesting seabirds and warm lagoon. The stage was set for what historian John Keegan would later call the most decisive naval battle of modern times. The first fingers of sunlight had barely touched the eastern horizon when the Japanese striking force thundered into the air from their carrier decks on the morning of June 4th. 108 aircraft, bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, formed up in precise formations before turning toward Midway, 30 miles distant. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the attack wave. His bomber laden with high explosives meant to shatter the island's defenses. "Tora! Tora! Tora! The same battle cry that had echoed over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now galvanized the Japanese airmen as they set course for their target. On the flight deck of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched his planes disappear into the distance with satisfaction. The first phase of Operation MI was underway. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming raid at 5:30 a.m. Klaxons wailed across the tiny atoll. Marine fighters, outdated Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of Wildcats scrambled into the air to meet the onslaught. Marine Captain Kirk Armistead knew his men were outmatched, but issued simple orders. Stay alive and make them pay. The National Museum of the Pacific War notes that the Marine defenders of Midway, though outnumbered and outgunned, mounted a defense so spirited it would later be credited with disrupting Nagumo's carefully orchestrated timetable. The Japanese struck Midway with devastating effect. Bombs cratered the runways, destroyed oil tanks, and set buildings ablaze. Black smoke boiled skyward as the attackers methodically worked over their target. Yet the damage, while severe, fell short of complete destruction. The vital airfield remained operational, and crucially, the American torpedo bombers and dive bombers stationed on the island had already departed to search for the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Tominaga radioed a stark assessment to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This seemingly routine communication would prove to be a pivotal moment in naval history. Far to the northeast, the American carriers launched their own strikes, based on best guess positions of the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, took off at 7 a.m., followed by similar squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. Flying obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers, these men were about to make aviation history, though few would live to know it. Back on the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. His scouts had not reported any American ships in the area, but Tominaga's request for a second strike meant his aircraft needed to be reconfigured. The planes reserved for attacking ships were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. To hit land targets on Midway, they would need general-purpose bombs instead. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered the switch. Bombs and torpedoes were removed from aircraft and carried below to the hangars. Fuel lines snaked across decks as planes were refueled. It was precisely at this moment of extreme vulnerability that a Japanese scout plane reported, 10 enemy ships sighted. The American carriers had been found. Nagumo immediately reversed his order. The bombs being loaded were hurriedly removed, and torpedoes were brought back up from the magazines. The Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos as ordnance was shuffled about, creating dangerous congestion on the hangar decks. At 8:20 a.m., the first American attack arrived, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. In what would become one of the war's most poignant episodes of bravery, 15 obsolete Devastators lumbered in at low altitude, vulnerable and slow. Japanese Zero fighters pounced mercilessly. One by one, the American planes were shot down in flames. Of 30 men who attacked, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean surrounded by the wreckage of his squadron. Yet this seeming disaster served a crucial purpose. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was drawn down to sea level to deal with the torpedo bombers. What they didn't see was what was coming next, from above. As Admiral Nagumo and his staff parsed the confusing reports coming in, they missed the most critical development of all. American dive bombers were approaching from high altitude, and the Japanese carriers lay below them, decks cluttered with planes, fuel, and bombs. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey squinted against the glare of the morning sun as he led Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons through the scattered clouds. His fuel gauges were dropping into the red zone. The search had taken too long. Just as he contemplated turning back, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, moving at flank speed through the waves below. Making a split-second decision, that would alter the course of the war. McCluskey reasoned that the destroyer was rushing to rejoin the main Japanese fleet. He ordered his squadrons to follow its wake. At 10:25 a.m. on June 4th, McCluskey's hunch paid off spectacularly. Breaking through a cloud layer, the American pilots beheld an astonishing sight. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, sailing in a loose formation with their escorting vessels. Better still, from the Americans' perspective, the carriers' decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. "Attack targets below," McCluskey radioed, as he pushed his dauntless dive bomber into a steep dive toward the Kaga. Almost simultaneously, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived from a different direction. By sheer coincidence, or perhaps, as some would later suggest, divine providence, the American attacks converged on the Japanese carriers at precisely their moment of greatest vulnerability. Smithsonian Institution analysis later concluded that the 5-minute span between 10:25 and 10:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, represents perhaps the most consequential 5 minutes in modern naval history. What followed was devastating. In its efficiency, American bombs found their marks with deadly accuracy. The first bomb to hit the Kaga crashed through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar below, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation fuel ignited. Within minutes, the proud carrier was transformed into a floating inferno. The flagship Akagi fared no better. A single 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Richard Best's dive bomber pierced the flight deck near the midship elevator, triggering a chain reaction of explosions as it detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft below. Admiral Nagumo, watching in horror from the bridge, could scarcely comprehend the sudden reversal of fortune. The third carrier, Soryu, was struck by 3 bombs in quick succession. Like her sisters, she was soon engulfed in uncontrollable fires. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible for miles across the Pacific. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, temporarily escaped the American onslaught, having been separated from the others by several miles. Upon learning of the disaster befalling his compatriots, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu immediately launched a counterattack against the American carriers. Hiryu's strike found the USS Yorktown at 12:40 p.m. Despite valiant efforts by her fighter cover, 3 Japanese bombs hit the American carrier, starting fires and stopping her engines. A second wave of Japanese torpedo bombers further damaged Yorktown, leaving her listing heavily. Though her crew performed heroic damage control, the Yorktown would ultimately be lost. First to abandonment, then to a Japanese submarine 2 days later. Yet the Japanese success against Yorktown came too late to change the day's outcome. American scout planes located the Hiryu that afternoon, and at 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise attacked with the same devastating effectiveness they had shown earlier. 4 direct hits transformed Hiryu into a blazing wreck. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing to leave his doomed ship, went down with her several hours later. As night fell over the Pacific, the strategic balance had been upended. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same 4 that had attacked Pearl Harbor, lay burning or sunk. Over 300 elite Japanese naval aviators, irreplaceable veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns, were dead. The cream of Japan's naval air arm had been wiped out in a single afternoon. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the catastrophic news aboard his flagship Yamato, made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and withdraw his remaining forces. "I had no idea this kind of engagement would be forced upon us," he reportedly said to his staff. The battle had turned on moments of incredible courage, lucky timing, and fateful decisions. Perhaps none was more significant than the sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons, whose seemingly futile attacks had pulled down the Japanese combat air patrol, clearing the way for the dive bombers to strike unimpeded. As stars appeared over the still-burning wreckage of once mighty carriers, both sides counted the cost and contemplated what had just transpired around this insignificant speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The morning of June 5th dawned over a Pacific Ocean forever changed. Smoldering wreckage marked the graves of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The USS Yorktown, though severely damaged, remained afloat, a testament to American damage control procedures and the tenacity of her crew. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered the carrier abandoned the previous evening, but a skeleton crew returned in the morning light to attempt salvage operations. Admiral Yamamoto's remaining forces, powerful battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, steamed westward in retreat, leaving behind the burning hulks of their carriers and the bodies of their fallen comrades. The vaunted Kido Butai, Japan's carrier striking force that had ranged unchallenged across the Pacific for 6 months, had been virtually annihilated in a single day. The Washington Post's military analyst would later write, "At Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost not only 4 irreplaceable carriers, but also the strategic initiative in the Pacific War, an initiative they would never regain. The human cost was staggering. Japan lost approximately 3,000 sailors and airmen, including over 100 of their most experienced pilots. The Americans suffered about 300 dead, with the majority from the Yorktown and the torpedo squadrons. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's 30 airmen, was rescued from the ocean after spending 30 hours floating in his life jacket, watching the entire battle unfold around him. On June 6th, the Japanese submarine, I-168, located the crippled Yorktown and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck the American carrier, and 1 hit the destroyer USS Hamon alongside. The Hamon sank immediately with heavy loss of life, while the Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds on the morning of June 7th, rolling over and sinking beneath the waves. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy faced the difficult task of explaining the disaster to Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese people. No mention was made of the lost carriers. Instead, the official communiqué claimed a great victory, with 2 American carriers sunk and the invasion of Midway proceeding as planned. It would be months before the Japanese public learned even a portion of the truth. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report to Washington, was understated in his assessment. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence. Strategic analysts immediately recognized the battle's significance. Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War and would never regain it. The defeat demolished Japan's carefully constructed timetable for Pacific conquest. Plans for operations against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were abandoned. The projected invasion of Hawaii was permanently shelved. For the Americans, Midway provided more than just tactical victory. It offered psychological redemption after 6 months of defeat and retreat. The New York Times' front page proclaimed, "Navy smashes Jap fleet at Midway," while the Chicago Tribune declared it the greatest naval victory of the war. Perhaps the most profound strategic impact was on the naval balance of power. Japan's carrier force, painstakingly built over 2 decades, had been cut in half in a single day. More importantly, Japan could not replace these losses quickly. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with 10 large fleet carriers. By the evening of June 4th, they had only 5. American shipyards, meanwhile, had over a dozen carriers under construction. Admiral Nimitz recognized that Midway had not won the war. Far from it. Japanese land forces continued to advance in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Their remaining naval forces remained powerful, but the strategic momentum had shifted. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the initiative in the Pacific War belonged to the Americans. In the aftermath, both sides sought to understand what had gone wrong and right. For the Japanese, the defeat stemmed from multiple factors: Yamamoto's overly complex battle plan, Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm, his second-wave aircraft, inadequate scouting, and poor damage control procedures aboard their carriers. For the Americans, victory came through intelligence superiority, tactical flexibility, extreme courage from the torpedo bomber crews, and a healthy dose of luck, the kind that Napoleon had once said he preferred in his generals. As the waters of the Pacific closed over the wreckage of once mighty warships, one thing was clear: the tide of war had turned. Dear Mrs. Waldron, the Department of the Navy deeply regrets to inform you. Thousands of such letters made their way across the Pacific in the weeks following the Battle of Midway. Behind the strategic calculations and tactical maneuvers lay the human dimension of the battle, stories of extraordinary courage, split-second decisions, and terrible loss. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had addressed his torpedo squadron, 8 before they took off on their fatal mission. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." His words proved prophetic. Not a single torpedo found its mark, but the sacrifice of his squadron helped secure victory. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the initial attack on Midway, volunteered to lead a follow-up strike, even though he lacked sufficient fuel to return to his carrier. After attacking the American forces, he pointed his damaged aircraft toward the Japanese fleet, knowing he would run out of fuel before reaching it. His last radio message was simple: "This is my last chance. I will go all out." He was never seen again. The Japanese Defense Ministry archives contain a letter from Tominaga to his wife, written the night before the battle. It reads in part, "Cherry blossoms scatter and fall at the height of their beauty. I will fall in the same way for the Emperor and for Japan." On Midway itself, the Marines who had weathered the Japanese air attacks emerged from their foxholes to witness the distant columns of smoke rising from the burning carriers. Private Arthur Curry later recalled, "We knew something big was happening out there, but none of us realized we were watching history being made." The battle's human dimension extended to the families waiting at home. In Loomis, California, George Gay's parents received first the dreaded telegram informing them their son was missing in action, then the joyous news of his survival. Gay himself became an instant celebrity, touring the United States to raise war bonds and morale. In Japan, the families of the lost aviators and sailors received no such closure. The Imperial Navy maintained the fiction of victory for months. Many families were simply told their loved ones were on a distant assignment or had been transferred to a special duty station. Euphemisms for death that provided little comfort. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the Japanese carriers, fell into a deep depression following the battle. Though he remained in command for several more months, colleagues noted he was a changed man. "The soul had gone out of him," one staff officer wrote. Nagumo would eventually commit suicide during the Battle of Saipan in 1944, choosing death over surrender. The battle changed individual lives in unexpected ways. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose perfectly placed bomb had doomed the Japanese flagship Akagi, inhaled caustic smoke during the battle. The resulting lung damage ended his flying career and plagued him for the rest of his life. He left the Navy in 1944 and lived in relative obscurity until historians rediscovered his crucial role decades later. For Ensign Albert Ernest of Torpedo Squadron 8, the battle's legacy was one of survivor's guilt. Having managed to return to the Enterprise after his torpedo run, the only pilot from his squadron to do so, he struggled with the question of why he had lived when so many others had died. "I wasn't the best pilot," he later confessed. "I wasn't the bravest. Why me?" Even the tiny atoll itself bore human scars. The Marine defenders had dug in for what they believed would be a final stand against Japanese invasion forces. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon had issued grim orders to his men: "When the Japanese come, it will be all of us against all of them. We will fight as long as we have anything to fight with." For weeks after the battle, the Marines continued improving their defenses, uncertain if the Japanese might return. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and the failed Midway operation, carried the burden of defeat heavily. "I have no regrets about my career," he reportedly told his staff, "except for that accursed American victory at Midway." Yamamoto had opposed war with the United States from the beginning, famously warning Japanese leaders he could run wild for 6 months. After that, "I have no expectation of success." His prediction had proved eerily accurate, almost to the day. As summer turned to fall in 1942, the human stories of Midway began to fade from headlines, replaced by new battles and fresh sacrifices. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the sky filled with burning aircraft and the sea dotted with flaming carriers, Midway would remain the defining moment of their lives. The scattered wreckage of carriers had barely settled on the Pacific seafloor when military historians began debating Midway's significance. Was it, as Admiral Ernest King claimed, the turning point of the war in the Pacific? Or was it merely one important battle among many? Time has rendered its verdict. Midway truly was the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. The United States, reeling from defeat 6 months earlier, seized the initiative and never relinquished it. From June 1942 onward, the strategic question was not whether Japan could win the war, but how long it would take to defeat her. The Atlantic Monthly's retrospective analysis in 1962 called Midway the Salamis of the Pacific War, the naval engagement that determined which civilization would dominate the world's largest ocean. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It fundamentally altered the character of the Pacific War. Gone was Japan's aura of naval invincibility. The myth of the superior Japanese aviator, fostered by victories from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea, was shattered. American naval aviators, once regarded as inexperienced and outclassed, had proven themselves equal to the challenge. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Midway marked the beginning of a long decline. The loss of 4 carriers was crippling, but the death of over 300 experienced pilots was catastrophic. Japan's Naval Air Arm had taken a decade to train these elite airmen. They could not be replaced quickly, and Japan's limited pilot training program never recovered from the blow. By contrast, American aircraft production and pilot training accelerated dramatically after Midway. The Essex-class carriers, launched in 1943, would soon dominate the Pacific in numbers Japan could never hope to match. By 1944, the United States had 24 fleet carriers in operation, a 17-fold increase from the pre-war force. Strategically, Midway forced Japan onto the defensive for the first time. The planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia were abandoned. Resources intended for Pacific expansion were redirected to defend the overextended empire. Admiral Yamamoto, recognizing the changed strategic reality, shifted his focus to holding what Japan had already conquered rather than seizing new territories. Within 2 months of Midway, the United States launched its first offensive operation of the Pacific War, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The pattern was set. From then until the end of the war, Japan would fight defensive battles against an ever-growing American juggernaut. Midway's legacy extended to naval doctrine and aircraft carrier operations. The battle conclusively demonstrated the aircraft carrier's supremacy over the battleship as the decisive weapon of naval warfare. Japan's super battleships Yamato and Musashi, commissioned after Midway, proved to be expensive anachronisms, ultimately sunk by carrier aircraft without ever fulfilling their designed role. The battle's influence on popular culture has been equally profound. Hollywood films like Midway, 1976 and remade in 2019, immortalized the battle for generations who had never heard a bomb fall. Books, documentaries, and video games have explored every aspect of the engagement. The battle's drama, its reversals of fortune, acts of heroism, and decisive outcome, continues to captivate military historians and casual readers alike. For the tiny atoll itself, the legacy has been mixed. Midway remained a vital American outpost throughout the Cold War. Today, it serves as the Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, home to millions of seabirds and other marine life. The runways where Marines once fought for their lives now host only nesting albatrosses. Nature has reclaimed what humans once contested so fiercely. In both Japan and the United States, Midway is remembered differently. For Americans, it represents a triumph of intelligence, courage, and determination, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. For the Japanese, it is remembered as Midway Kaisen, Mitsudue Haijan, the battle that began their long retreat across the Pacific. Perhaps the most fitting testament to Midway's significance came from Admiral Nimitz himself. When asked, years later, about the battle's place in history, the usually taciturn admiral replied, "Midway was the most crucial battle of the Pacific War, because it was there that the expanding Japanese Empire had reached its high water mark." Today, deep beneath the Pacific waves, the wrecks of the carriers Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, and Yorktown lie scattered across miles of ocean floor, silent monuments to an afternoon in June when the fate of nations hung in the balance. Advanced OI. Underwater exploration has only recently located some of these historic wrecks, providing new insights into the battle's final moments. The Goonie birds still waddle across Midway's runways, oblivious to the momentous events that unfolded there. Waves still break upon the atoll's shores. The sun still rises and sets over the vast Pacific horizon. But for those who understand history, This tiny speck of land will forever be remembered as the place where the tide of war turned, where courage, intelligence, sacrifice, and perhaps a measure of luck combined to change the course of world history. The legacy of Midway endures not just in military academies and history books, but in the world order that emerged from World War II, a world shaped by decisions made and actions taken during 5 crucial minutes above a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.